Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Melbourne Athletic Development Podcast. Jack.
John.
How you going, mate?
Yeah, I'm doing well. It's good to be back doing this. It feels like it's been a while.
It has, fortunately for both of us.
We haven't had to see each other.
It's been good. Today we thought we would talk about a topic that I think in general is, something that people are interested in, which is youth development, particularly in the arena of sports performance and also in terms of injury management or prevention. So I think it's, something that people are interested in and they want to learn a little bit more about. And we often get a lot of questions when we have particularly adolescents come in who are involved in sport about what kind of things that they can do to improve their preparation for activity. And also reduce the risk of them having injuries in the future. Yeah,
and obviously there's a lot of similarities, but there are some key differences both in terms of how you develop youth athletes and even actually injuries themselves, and perhaps that's a topic of conversation for another podcast, but there are some distinct differences based on the maturation of the system, that concept of i.e. their training history and their physical development, in addition to the plasticity of the neural system.
So you're telling me you can't just train kids like adults?
You can try. It might not work that effectively, but
I think that's the first question that people tend to have, because we see this a lot. Obviously, I'm involved in track and field, but we work in a lot of different sports. We work in basketball and rowing, and obviously distance running is massive for us. Obviously Lydia has a really big background in weightlifting. We're involved with a hockey club. So we see the gamut, right? We see the people who are developing in their sport quite significantly. And one of the things that's often asked of us is, what kind of training they think is important for the development of, them as an adolescent, or their parents are asking these questions.
Yeah.
And there does seem to be a little bit of a mismatch between what is good for their development and what is good for their performance right now.
Yeah, and if you think about it, it makes sense to well, I want my child to become really good at AFL. I'm just going to get to the focus on that. They're going to be playing school footy, club footy, rep footy, basically playing footy all year round. And it does make a lot of sense to think you're going to see them be able to refine their skill set in that domain quite quickly. But I think one of the things that you just alluded to then is we do need to think about timelines, because undoubtedly you're going to see in the short term some improvements, particularly if they're relatively new to that sport. But we do see consequences to what you call early specialisation. Do
you want to define that for people? Because I think it's a term that gets used often, but I think, this podcast, I think we're slightly, we're obviously talking about it because it's something that we're interested in, but we're probably attacking, both, the general consumer as well as some of the people that we work with who are more on the performance side of things or are more on the health side of things. So specialization, what exactly is it?
Yeah, so as the term suggests, it's the specialization, the focus on one particular sport in this situation. So
it could be any skill though, it might
that's
be
true.
Music, it might be whatever. It's they really focus narrowly on that skill set.
Yes.
And they spend a lot of time practicing that, whether that's, if it's music, it's, a lot of practice hours.
For sure.
If it's a particular sport, it might be a lot of, preparation training for that sport, or a lot of competition, as you just alluded to with the football.
Yeah, exactly. And look, it's actually worth making that distinction between when specialization is not effective, but there actually are some times where specialization early on is effective.
Yeah.
Good example that you made before is music. So, I have a brother who is a classical pianist.
Yeah, Tom's been on the podcast.
Yeah, it's been on the podcast indeed. You don't get that good by starting at 18. You look at all professional musicians, and what I'm talking more classical musicians here.
Yeah, classically trained musicians who might play in an orchestra or something
Correct.
like that.
They're particularly the best ones. They're starting at 2, 3, 4 years of age, and there are some examples too of that in sport. So gymnastics is a common one. When you think about gymnasts, typically their peak performance is what? How old are they usually? Into the mid-teens?
Well, for females particularly, it's usually sort of around 16 to 18. It's getting a little bit older, actually, which is interesting. And some of that's the culture is changing around their development. But the males tend to be a little bit older. They're in their 20s.
Yeah. So when we go back to this concept of specialization, the deliberate choice of focusing on one particular sport or endeavor, we think about things like music, is actually something that is beneficial for someone who's looking for elite status.
Well, let's talk about why that might be the case. I think, someone that we've referred to a fair bit is someone like David Epstein, and he uses a nice description, I think, that's useful for this. You mentioned in a podcast we did recently, is the difference between a kind learning environment and a wicked learning environment.
Yeah, I quite like those terms actually, because
I think it describes it well.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can think about a kind environment, and that is it's somewhat kind in that there are more constraints. Or another way of thinking about it, there are less variables you need to consider. So again, a good example is music or gymnastics is similar. You know exactly what's ahead of you. You know exactly what you need to do.
You don't have opponents. Someone's not going to tackle you on the stage. Correct. While you're playing the violin.
You don't need to make decisions in the moment. You don't have to go, hang on a second, this person has responded this way, I need to change.
Well, you might. I actually was recently talking about music. This is a silly example, but I was watching the Australian violinist Ray Chen playing, and his string broke on his violin mid, playing Vivaldi or something like that, and he had to swap out his violin while he was playing, which I thought was quite funny. So he did have to make a decision there.
And look, I mean, let's be clear. This idea of a wicked versus kind environment is a spectrum, so to speak. Like there are obviously certain exceptions you can make to these two distinctions.
So, for instance, if we give examples for people, what kind of activities or sports would fall into that kind environment, and which ones would fall into that more wicked environment, and thus maybe alter the way that we develop that specialization pathway? Sure.
So, look, gymnastics is a good example because you know exactly what is ahead of you. You know exactly what needs to be done. You've obviously rehearsed repetitively the exact performance you're going to do. You know exactly what equipment's going to be involved. You know that's going to be in a closed environment in the sense you're not going to have to deal with things like wind or temperature. Hopefully, I wouldn't imagine that fluctuates too much.
Not in an indoor setting, no.
No. On the other end of the spectrum, when we think about a wicked environment, most team and ball sports fall into this. So we can think about things like basketball, things like soccer or football, rugby, AFL. This is considered a wicked environment in that it is an open environment. What I mean by that is that there are lots of variables that are not under your control. And what I mean by that is think about the fact that you have to respond in a team sport to both your teammates but also to the opposition. You have to take into consideration the position and the movement of the ball. You have to take into consideration even like things like
conditions,
weather. Yeah. Absolutely. These are all factors, and not to mention tactics and tactics that will change even from game to game, depending on the opponent, or maybe even depending on how the game is progressing and the particular time point within the game. And then there's some that you could fit perhaps in between or somewhere in the middle. Like I think of something like golf. It's much more towards a kind environment because again,
it's still outdoors, but
still outdoors. And obviously, what you do on your second and subsequent shots is dependent on what you do on the shot before. There are changes in the wind and environment. There are changes in the courses that you're on. So there are some things to consider. It would typically be considered more of a kind environment because
at least probably somewhere in the middle, isn't it? Like if you have, say, something like gymnastics or even, say, 100-meter sprinting, they tend to be much more in that kind end. And then, you get something like golf, it's slightly in the middle. And then you go to those team sports where there's lots of variables. That's probably going to be on the more wicked environment.
Yes. So, and when we come back to discussing youth development and specialization, it's important to make these distinctions of how you classify the particular sport because that will determine whether specialization is going to be effective or not. Now, typically speaking, specialization is something that is not going to be effective for most sports because most sports fit more towards that wicked environment.
Okay, question is why? Why is specialization less valuable in a sport that has more variables? Because the fundamental question you'd ask is, well, don't you then need to practice in that environment more in order to get better at it sooner?
Yeah.
And there are lots of examples, particularly I would say maybe soccer's probably the one where people start at a very young age, they go through academy type systems and they develop very high levels of skill, and that is a pathway essentially of early specialization.
Yeah, look, I don't know the specifics for soccer exactly, but it's interesting to looking at other sports. Like I know there's been some research looking at, say, basketball and elite basketball players, where if you look at the ones who typically become the best, they are the ones that even within their late adolescence, they're participating still in multiple sports.
Well, I think the prime example of that, and this will open up a debate in itself, but the greatest basketballer of all time, Michael Jordan, played baseball for much of his high school years.
Yeah.
And even loved it so much that obviously he tried to, during his career, go and play baseball again. And was obviously a very good baseball player in all relative terms.
Yes.
So it shows that he was not only focused on basketball. He was developing other skills as well.
Yes, and there's always exceptions. You know, I know people, we have these conversations, they go, oh, what about this player though? What about that player? Of course there are exceptions. It's typically about the rule. You know, that you see that the majority of the best performing athletes in more wicked sports, wicked environments, are the ones who participated in lots of different sports for a lot of their development through childhood and adolescence. And then typically, you know, like they might get to say 15, 16, 17, where you start to realize, okay, this person really has skill and ability, and you can then start to specialize.
And I think, or even David Epstein, for those people interested, if you do want to read Range, it's a very, very interesting book. But he brings up Roger Federer, and I think it's the first chapter of the introduction. And he says, you know, he was in an environment that would have been conducive to him specializing early. Like his parents were tennis coaches, and particularly his mother. And he played tennis, but he also did other sports, and he kind of waxed and waned about how involved he was. And then when he realized, okay, I am pretty good at this, he started to specialize a little bit later and went on to obviously be one of the best tennis players in history.
Yeah, and I mean, like, it's not to suggest that if you play lots of sports, you're going to become the lead athlete. I played plenty of different sports when I was young, and I would say I'm a relatively very average athlete. But
you give yourself in these wicked environments more opportunity to be good by developing what we call multilateral skills.
Yeah, and this comes back to your question of like, why is this the case? Because again, when you think about it on the face of it, it's like, well, wouldn't me focusing on one particular sport help me develop skill sets specific to that sport? And technically that's correct. The issue though is but depending on how much diversity you have through what you would call like those key developmental periods of your life. So basically from childhood to sort of middle, late adolescence, that provides essentially physical and sensory feedback to your body and your brain that develops what you would call more, say, diversity or complexity in your sensory motor system. So what's sensory motor system? Well, as the name suggests, sensory, i.e. input, motor, i.e. output. When
so you think it's how well you sense things in your environment and how well you can then respond through the motor actions that you create.
Yes, exactly. So you think about movement that we create to perform any task, whether it's got to do with walking, sprinting, playing a particular sport. We all have particular movement patterns and signatures, but for those interested, we did a talk with Dr. Jake Cohen on movement variability, which fits in with this very well. People of very high performance or elite status, contradictory to what you think, they don't necessarily show the exact same pattern to how they kick a ball or how they hit a tennis ball or how they hit a golf ball. We actually see variability in that particular performance or task.
And the interesting part about that is they can get very similar outcomes for what happens. So say if it's a tennis serve, for instance, they will always land the ball where they want it if they're an elite performer.
Yes.
But actually the way that they've set up their swing or the position they've started from can vary, right? And whilst they'll follow a similar pattern, if they actually, and this is some of the stuff that we were speaking about with Jake, but if you do in-depth biomechanical analysis, use things like a Vicon system and 3D analysis, you'll see that they actually don't follow the exact same movement. Their arm might shift a little bit more at one point to another. So even though they're an expert in this area, they don't always actually follow the exact same movement pattern. But they can get the same outcome because they have a really strong understanding of how to create performance with a level of variability in their in their execution.
Yes, and so going back to youth development, a really simple way to think about it is if you're exposing yourself to lots of different types of physical or motor challenges or tasks, you're building up diversity in what your body can physically do. When you then think about later on, when you, let's say, getting into later adolescence, early adulthood, and you may start to then specialize or focus in a particular sport, how your brain and your sensory motor system solves or provides a solution to a particular task is going to have more tools or more options to choose from. And now, when you think about wicked environments, whether you're playing AFL or you're playing basketball, no two situations are really the same.
No. They're always slightly different.
They're always slightly different. You're slightly further away from the goalpost. You're at a slightly different angle. The wind's slightly different. Someone's running you from this direction. You've got to kick over your shoulder. There's just so many variables to consider. And when you think about it, you don't have time to cognitively process all those different variables. At a subconscious level, you're going, this is what I need to do to get the ball from here to here. Because ultimately, that's what you're thinking.
Yeah.
Like, get it through the post, get it into the hoop. And it turns out that having that exposure to more variety when you're going through that developmental stage allows your brain and your body to create more nuanced strategies to the specific demands or requirements of that particular movement or task at that point in time. And interestingly, you could come up to a similar situation again, but you might use a slightly different strategy. And that may be because some of the variables are slightly different. You're in a slightly different position relative to the post, the opponent's in a different position, or it could even be things like because you're fatigued as well. And that's also an important thing to remember, that when you think about these wicked environments, well, this is actually for any particular physical task, there's also internal changes that happen. Are you fatigued? Did you have a poor night's sleep that night? Are you recovered from the previous game? Did you just break up with your partner and you're under psycho-emotional stress? Those things all influence our sensory motor behavior. So depending on those variables or stresses going on will determine whether you are effective at still completing the task and the outcome, or whether you're not.
So we've mentioned, obviously, this concept that you don't necessarily want to specialize early. In terms of youth development, what then should be the approach of someone who's maybe guiding, whether they're a coach or whether they're, involved as a health practitioner, or even if they're a parent? Like, what kind of approach should they start to look at? What are the things that you should be looking to develop, and can you plan that out so that not only are they going to have more skills, but maybe they're a little bit more resilient in terms of developing injuries?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing to look at is look at the current training status of the individual, but also then look at a larger timescale, looking at the training status and the participation in sports over, say, a whole year. Because, typically speaking...
Well, it is one of the problems that we see a lot, isn't it? Where, as you mentioned, these children are playing sport, say, at club, school, rep level, and every single night of the week they have training or competition. And often one of the recommendations that we say is like you actually have to take out some of those things. And it's really hard for them to understand that it's better for their development if they do remove things rather than if they keep participating at that level of frequency.
Yeah, and look, we could probably break that down to a few different levels, because apart from making sure that they're not specialising too soon, I even think about the inappropriate training stimulus and how that influences things like their muscle phenotype profile as well. When what I'm referring to there is, I think particularly in Australia, where we have very much a culture that promotes sort of endurance, the idea of putting in more work.
Well, it's very funny you say that, actually, Jake. Yeah. At the moment, Tom, who works with us as our, performance head of our performance staff, and myself have been working with a number of AFL footballers working on speed training. And they're in the off season, so it's an interesting kind of concept. You know, we've been contacted by a few different clubs to say, can you help out these individual players get faster? And they come down and they have a really strong understanding of what they need to do from an endurance capability, but they have almost no understanding of how to get faster, right? And it's not through lack of knowledge, I think, at the club level. There are some, you know, especially even some of the people that have asked us to help out with this are actually very experienced in this area. They just don't actually get the time allocation to work with these players on developing, say, speed skills. So it's left to periods, say, the off-season, where it's not even pre-season, it's before they've even started the pre-season, and the players are not really going to the club, that they seek out information in this area. But if you ask them about, what do I need to hit for my endurance capabilities, they're very, very clear on that. And I think it speaks to exactly what you're saying of like the huge gap that there seems to be in the knowledge of, you know, the desire to get better in an endurance space versus, say, getting faster.
Yeah, and look, this, talking about, say, for instance, I mean, particularly here in Victoria, Australia, where something like AFL is a very, very strong sport. When we think about youth development, I think we also have to be cognizant of some of the psychological elements associated with a 14-year-old AFL player who may have some talent, gets into a rep team, but then starts being told things about their future that may be true, but also, you know, may not be true in the sense of, you know, you're not going to be the next biggest star. Because obviously, too, for a 14-year-old to hear that, they're like, okay, this is great. Tell me exactly what I need to do. If I need to train 5 times a week and play 3 games on the weekend, so be it. The reality is the amount of people who follow that path and have success is going to be relatively limited. I mean, the reality is the amount of people who are going to make it professionally into professional sport is going to be limited regardless. But we have to understand that, again, although intuitively it seems to make sense of, I've got these opportunities to, you know, be involved with these coaches and do all these things related to whatever sport I'm interested in, we have to understand that there are consequences to that as you get into the later years of your adolescence and then eventually into adulthood and looking to pursue that sport professionally.
On that, so I think that's something, and I'll talk to it at one point about from the perspective of speed and sprinting, but what are some of the consequences that you do get from early specialization that potentially then does limit your performance later? Because I think that's something that people don't seem to get is, whilst you might get a boost in your performance right now, you're actually robbing Peter to pay Paul. You know, in the future, you may have actually taken away your development and you've lowered your ceiling, as an analogy.
Yes. Because
you've actually not necessarily addressed some of the development things that are much more difficult to develop later in your overall, you know, maturation.
Yeah, and that's probably a good way to conceptualize this. Of think of it, the fact that we all have ceilings, right? And so
when we say ceilings, we don't mean on our house.
Yes.
The upper limit of your performance,
correct,
whether that be physically or in some sort of skill set, like playing a sport.
Yes, and so it's actually a good way to explain it, where let's just use like arbitrarily that you've got some 13-year-old kid who has a ceiling of 50 units, you know, we're just making some arbitrary thing here of like, let's say that they're currently
50
at
Bitcoin.
50, I wish. You know, they're currently at 30. And you know that if you get them to specialise now over the next 2 years, by the time they're 14, 15, they'll probably get to that ceiling of 50. And, you know, they're going to be performing potentially at a very good level. The problem is if they reach that ceiling when they're 15, there's nowhere else to go. And although during the next couple of years you might actually perform at a high level, you start to see that when you get into 17, 18, 19, some of your other competitors have a ceiling of 60, 70, 80, and they're starting to reach it in that later point in their life. And this is where it's very important to understand that when we diversify sport through that youth development, you're increasing that ceiling. So that ceiling of 50 or whatever
and
it is.
We're not just saying this off our own bat. There's actually research on this. So particularly in the youth development arena, there's two researchers that have done amazing work. Gregory Myers and Avery Fagenbaum. They're based in the US, but they've done a huge amount of research looking at the physical development features for youth athletes. And they actually write the position statements, particularly for the National Strength and Conditioning Association and a number of sports on this. And they show that developing these multilateral skills in a wide variety of physical skills pushes your ceiling up. And when you start that, will actually have an effect on how high your ceiling actually is. So in a really cited study that they did in 2011, they talk about the difference between starting that development as prepubescent, so before puberty starts, during puberty or post-puberty. And what they find is that actually the windows of development close if you start later. Now, I will put the caveat on it, that doesn't mean that's specialized training. What we're talking about is, as we said, that diversity of movement experience or different skill sets. So if you have your child, and this is not to say take your child out to play 12 different sports every week, but if you have a young athlete or your child, for instance, is interested in developing their skills, it's actually valuable for them to what they call trial different activities, whether that's be playing with their skateboard, doing some gymnastics, playing footy, going in the summer doing some cricket, doing different things that require different movement patterns of them, right? Through that really what they call the skill hungry years, which generally are between the sort of like 7 or 8 to about 12. If you expose them to more, particularly at a reasonable level of intensity, so when I say reasonable level, I mean like they're enjoying it and they're having play and they're being children still, they do develop skills that are going to be beneficial in the long term, rather than as an 8-year-old saying, I'm going to be Don Bradman and I'm only going to play cricket. Right? That will actually probably slow their ceiling, or they'll limit their ceiling from being as high as what it potentially could be.
Yeah, the other thing I think it's worth explaining or sharing at least is, again, I think back with our discussion with Jake Cohen, I thought he put it well, where if you look at a kid who, for instance, you give them a basketball and you start getting them to try and shoot it through a hoop, to begin with, they'll start sampling lots of different ways to do it, to try and figure out, how do I do it? How do I get it through? And then once they find one particular solution, they'll start to explore that further and develop more of a refined approach of that particular movement pattern.
And I think, they create certainty around that too. Like it's funny you say that, because I think that you see that in other areas with younger children. They find, say, some sort of strategy that works for them, might be in dealing with their friends or whatever, and they just keep repeating the same thing until they realize, oh wait, that doesn't work in every single situation. And neither of us are parents, but we work obviously with adolescents a lot in our clinical work, and you see that they will try the same thing over and over until they feel like they've got it, and then you're like, okay, I need to find a task that pushes them out of that. And that's why it's useful to sample other sports or other activities.
And you can even appreciate from the standpoint of basketball versus AFL versus cricket are going to develop very different physical components. And it's important to understand that there is transfer in some ways, whether it's maybe related to some of the physical components that you develop through a particular sport, but then particularly from that neural complexity that you develop as well, where you think about basketball, it's going to develop certain motions associated with your upper limb and how you coordinate that with your lower limb. It's going to create lateral movement. It's going to create multi-directional awareness, as opposed to, cricket. It might not necessarily develop, well, you might get a little bit of lateral development, but, it's going to develop your ability to respond very quickly to fast-moving objects. It's going to develop certain movement patterns associated with like holding a particular implement and having to make contact with the ball. That then might transfer to tennis, which has a different shape. Those kind of things, you can start to appreciate that there is a transfer there that is fundamental to creating that elevation of that ceiling. And ultimately, that's the thing that we want to create with optimizing the outcomes of an adolescent as they go into adulthood. Is where is their ceiling and potential? And that's obviously particularly important when you think about it from someone who wants to perform at a high level.
We spoke about training load before, and obviously we spoke about people participating in a lot of the same sport. What are the aspects of developing someone's ability to tolerate training stress that you need to be aware of that differs between youth and, say, an adult?
Yeah, so you're thinking about in terms of how we develop that magnitude of stress? Is that what you're
but even just overall how well they can actually deal with participating in a physical activity.
Yeah.
I think, I'm sure you understand, I'm alluding to some of the discussions happened by, those researchers, Chu and Barnes, where they were talking about in youth development, you probably would like to develop a number of different features over a period of time. And maybe, for those people who understand a little bit about periodization, you may be looking at more sequencing those features because the actual individual can't deal with lots of stresses being placed on it at exactly the same time.
Yeah, and actually that brings up two things I think we need to talk about is thinking about how things like resistance training fit into youth development.
Yeah, that's a podcast in itself. Should youth be exposed to resistance training? And
yes, and then I think
a
also,
lot of people see that as maybe that's dangerous, or that's something that's discussed, and maybe we can allude to that.
Yeah, we probably discussed a bit here now, and then I think also it's the relationship between this and injuries as well too. But yes, because again, that's where I think it's important to think about. It happens naturally, I guess, with any sport that you play, in that the intensity and physical demands of playing rugby when you're 8 is very different to when you're 14, which is very different to when you're 21. And so I think naturally in some ways you're going to get an increase in your ability to tolerate physical stresses because of the actual physical maturation of yourself and the people that you play with. Actually, just thinking of that, it makes me think about too of... when you think about performance in youth, of the advantages of when you're born and also just perhaps when you physically develop and how that influences your outcomes over time.
Everyone talks about that, like the children that hit puberty early,
yes,
or are physically bigger than other athletes. They seem to carry massive advantages, and it's a big discussion that I have with a lot of parents that come in from track and field because their child maybe hasn't really reached what we call peak height velocity and had a growth spurt, and they feel like they were very competitive and now they're falling behind, and you have to give that education that physical maturation often doesn't happen in a linear fashion, and people will differ quite significantly with when they have these periods of growth, and it leads to all sorts of variation in what their physical output can be at that point of development.
Yeah, and look, it's something I think about from. Well, I think it's good to keep in context that. For the 12-year-old kid who's a bit of a man-child, although that helps them at that point playing sport, it also limits their development because they become too dependent on their physical attributes to dominate a particular sport.
Well, I think that's actually a really good point. And I'll ask you the question on this. Like, if someone is an early developer, what's the approach that you think that parents maybe should explore or coaches should explore? Because there is that challenge that athlete will get used to the idea that they can physically dominate whatever they're participating in rather than maybe developing some of the skills that are going to make them well-rounded in their development of that activity. Yeah,
well, look, just thinking off the top of my head, two things I think about is putting them into positions where they cannot use their physical abilities as much, or into sports, too, again, giving them exposure to sports where that is not something that's going to allow them to have an advantage, because that is something that really is going to limit your ability to start exploring ways that you can complete a physical task to score a try or get a point. And well, actually, before I go to the next point, I'll let you actually share any thoughts you've got with regards to how you actually address that problem too.
Well, I think it's so much of it is making sure that you're touching on all of the parts that lead to the ultimate performance. We speak about the pillars of sports performance: tactical, technical, psychological, and physical. Now, obviously, if one person has really excelled in the physical domain, you just need to make sure that they're continuing to develop in those other domains. And unfortunately, you do get this issue of these early developers psychologically having a lot of issues when, for instance, people catch up to them because they don't have the capability of exploiting that physical parameter that they had previously. And so then they have to, it's very psychologically challenging for them, because then they've got to go back and go, well, I actually have to get really good at these skills, or I have to understand the game tactically better to be able to utilize what I do have. And that's something that I think that if you see someone, and it's not a bad thing if someone physically develops early, doesn't mean that they won't have success in the future. It's just important that you continue to develop skills and not necessarily...
Well, unless that person, by the time they're 20, becomes 6'8" and 120 kilos. But yes, that's the exception, isn't it?
Yeah. But I think that even if someone, you think, okay, well, they're going to be of, say, average height and weight, and that is going to be, say, useful, or that's not going to limit them from participating at a professional level or whatever, an elite level in their sport. But they get there at 13 rather than at 16, like a lot of the other participants do. Have you actually developed some of those other skills that they're going to need when they are 18, 19, 20 plus? Because if you have, not only will they be better through those years anyway, they will maintain their position as being, able to achieve that elite performance. So I think it's just about identifying, do they have all of the skill sets that they need?
Yes.
And I think that this is the hard one, which I think is hard for the actual individual. It's hard for the parents, hard for the coaches, to make sure that you are, from the psychological point of view, not necessarily rewarding that person or giving them praise for the outcome at that point. And this actually feeds into, really interestingly, we've spoken about this I think before in terms of learning, but people like Joe Bowler, he does research in mathematics education. She speaks heavily, and she's got a really good book, if anyone's interested, called The Limitless Mind, I think it's called. Really good for educators, and if you're interested in this kind of thing, especially for parents. But her research is in mathematics education, and she talks about the research that was done by Carol Dweck. And parents would be aware of this idea of the what do they call it? The growth mindset versus fixed mindset. And growth mindset's all about people who are willing to see, there's opportunities for learning in every situation. No matter what happens, if you have a failure, you see it as an opportunity for growth. Versus people who are fixed seem to think, well, this is my lot. This is what I'm stuck with. If I can't do it, then I can't really get much better at this. And I think it's really important, because the research that they did showed that even the terminology that you use with a younger person has to be related to not necessarily rewarding the outcome that they get, but more the effort that they put in. And if you reward them by saying, oh, you're so good at this, you're so smart, they actually found over time that those students that kept protecting their so-called status of intelligence and were less willing to take on challenging, and this is obviously in mathematics research, mathematics tasks, rather than having a growth mindset where their effort was rewarded. So even if the student was excelling in mathematics, they were saying, that was really excellent effort. You've obviously worked really hard on those questions. Let me find more challenging questions for you, because it creates the opportunity for them to continue growing. And I think the same thing should happen for that early developer, where you say, well done. You've obviously worked really hard at developing the skills that you've developed. Let's find some, as you said, situations where we can challenge your skills more, rather than just saying, oh, you're a gun. You're way better than all of these other kids. Look at you dominate them. Let's go and celebrate.
Well, and it's funny, like I was going to mention the exact same analogy, but from the opposite perspective, where if you've got a child who, let's say, is smaller and is slower to physically develop, you can appreciate that if you get them involved in a sport where having physical size is advantageous, which they don't have, it starts to get them to think about, how do I how do I make sure I can get around and
it's funny, like you can probably give some better examples, but I know that this is a very common story in NBA, and I know you're an NBA fan. You probably, I don't know if you have some examples for us, but this seems to happen often where someone who has played as, say, a point guard because they were physically smaller, then all of a sudden does actually have some, growth in height. So it means that they can potentially play a different position, but they bring along with them the skills that they developed as a player who was smaller.
Yeah, look, I don't follow that much now, but I do know one example of a current NBA player who, if people who follow NBA would know, is Anthony Davis, who plays for the LA Lakers, who's like 6'10" or 11. But throughout his childhood, he was like, I think, tall, but not necessarily
in basketball terms. He wasn't.
Yeah, he was a point guard. I think up until I think what they call freshman year or whatever it was, until he was about 15 or 16, and he went from 6 foot to 6'6" to 6'10".
Yeah, and
so you can appreciate, and for people who know who this player is, he's someone who clearly has physical size, but has the skill set of a small player who used to having the ball and being able to handle the ball effectively. So it creates a very unique skill set. And the same happens for any particular individual who's involved in a sport where physical contact or physical size is advantageous, but you don't have that, is you start to think about, all right, I need to get around this player. I need to accelerate more. I need to have more lateral quickness. I need to be able to fake a pass, whatever it may be. But you can start to appreciate it develops certain skill sets that allows you to still be effective and have a good outcome with whatever sport you play, despite the fact that you might not have the physical attributes. Now, I mean, there's always going to be potentially a limit. Obviously certain sports do require certain physical traits. Obviously, like again, think about basketball. You may be the best point guard in the world, but if you're 5'8", you're probably going to be limited in your ability.
What about Muggsy Bogues?
Yeah, well, there are exceptions. I don't know if there's any examples of that these days, though. But
he's still one of the. I think he's a Hall of Famer.
Sure. Let's talk about exceptions versus rules here, hey?
Well, I think what it points out is that the job of anyone who's trying to develop youth, performance is about making sure that you're covering off on all of the skill sets that you need, as I said. And a good way of looking at it is it technically, do they have, when I say technically, I mean, do they have the actual technical skills, whether it's kicking or passing or shooting or whatever it is, have they developed those? Have they developed tactical understanding of, being able to read the play and see what their opposition's doing and see what their teammates are doing and understanding how to read their opposition and all of those kind of things. And then having the psychological traits, and a lot of that's probably built into some of those ideas around learning and the growth mindset that we mentioned, as well as, developing and enhancing their competitiveness in a really healthy manner, learning to actually be someone who can participate and be competitive, but not to the point where it's detrimental to their, overall interaction and performance. And then obviously, the last one is the physical one. And we've obviously been speaking a fair bit about the physical one, but it's only one part of it. So when you have this issue of youth development, if it's not working to your advantage, in one way or the other, understand that that's one of 4 parts of your overall performance in this activity. So you can go and work on those things maybe whilst you are waiting for your growth spurt to happen. Yeah. Doesn't mean that, you can't develop other physical aspects, which we'll probably talk about now because we should talk about injury and how do we maybe, manage some of those things through development stages. But there are opportunities everywhere if you're willing to continue to develop the whole picture.
Yeah. So do you want to talk a bit about injury then?
Yeah, well, I think obviously, there are obviously some unique injuries that we see in youth development.
Yeah.
The key ones that we tend to see is what we call these attraction apophysitis type injuries. And for those people who have unfortunately been afflicted by this, it's usually what happens is the attachments, particularly of the tendon and the muscle complex at different points of the body, especially the ones that are under high stress. So at the knee, at the ankle, at the hip, tend to be typically overloaded. And during your development, often the tendon structure is actually stronger than the bone structure, or not completely, but there is more malleability to your bone structure until full maturation of your skeletal system. And so what you end up getting is, for these people who've had it, they'll know is, you end up with things like Seaver's lesions or Osgood-Schlatters syndrome, where the actual bone formation starts to actually be stretched, and you'll get these bumps that develop. They can become extremely uncomfortable and painful. And that's because the actual attachment site is being pulled upon by the mechanical tension of the musculotendinous, complex at that area. And that's actually got to do with, this huge amount of metabolism that's occurring within your tissue at the time. The really cool thing about being young, and everyone who particularly has children or can remember back, is, say if you have an injury when you're younger, you heal much quicker, and that's because your ability to actually turn over these tissues and cells happens at a much higher rate than when you are older. Now, that's not in every tissue, but we know about this. Say, for instance, if you fracture your arm as a child, it heals quicker than if you fracture your arm as an adult.
Yeah.
Right, and that's got to do with that. It's more complex than at a real base level, but that's got to do with that alteration in that skeletal maturity that I mentioned.
Yeah, and there's actually a few things we can use as examples. Like another example I think about is the importance of bone strength and quality development, particularly in females through childhood and adolescence, and how that is protective for developing osteoporosis post-menopause. And that is because with some of the hormonal changes that occur in females, particularly once you've reached menopause, it's disadvantageous for maintaining the integrity of your bony system. But because during your youth development, your bony system is so highly malleable, with applying appropriate physical load, you essentially build up a reserve of how dense and thick your bone structure is, so that you can then mitigate the potential of developing osteoporosis as you increase bone loss over time. It's good,
because I think there's two things that we can definitely touch on here that we talk about a lot, and there's a third one which we probably won't get into too much, which has got to do with the metabolic health of the system.
Sure.
It's a bit more complex, I think.
Yeah.
The two key ones, which we talk about a lot in lots of areas, and we've mentioned this before when we talk about tendon loading, is in order to lay down good bone, you need two major things. And you've just alluded to one, which is you need to expose people to mechanical load. And when we say mechanical, we mean like physical tasks that are under the imposition of gravity.
Sport, exercise.
Jumping, change of direction, running, all those kind of things. They put physical load through your body, and your bone responds by saying, okay, I'm being exposed to these high forces. I need to actually be stronger, and it starts laying down calcium within your bone structure.
Yeah, and collagen obviously too. Yeah.
The second part is, in order for it to do that, it needs to obviously be exposed to that, but you need the nutritional building blocks in order to actually lay down something when the signal comes along to say we need more bone. And the two biggest ones that often get spoken about are calcium, right? And I know that there's cofactors that you can allude to, but often really simple things like dairy products are really important to consume as a youth, developing person, particularly for females. Things like cheese and yogurt and milk are really useful. There's obviously other ways you can get that calcium input. And the other one, as you just mentioned, is collagen intake, because they are the main constituents that make up the overall structure of bone.
I think actually too, and it's just really worth highlighting this for people who are unfamiliar or interested, is the importance of high impact loading in particular for bone. And this is actually something that we should talk about with things like swimmers in particular.
Yes, and even endurance training can actually start leaching some of that calcium back out again.
Yeah, because you think about swimming where you're in a different medium, you're in water. You're not actually exposing yourself to high ground. We're not exposing yourself to any ground reaction forces whatsoever. So when I say that, I'm talking about when you think about sprinting or jumping, as you jump up in the air and you get the acceleration of your body down into the ground. That ground reaction force, i.e. that contact you make with the ground, is creating forces that are often magnitudes higher than your own body weight. And that provides a really important signal to the bone to ensure that it can then withstand those forces over time. I think the other thing that's really worth highlighting here too, when we think about bone and development, is the development of your skeletal system in different planes. And again, this is where diversity in sport, and particularly sports that are
3D.
3D, like work in 3 planes, is really important, because we can't just think about moving in forward and backwards. We think about all those rotational, diagonal, lateral movements, different surfaces as well. These are actually all valuable things too with the development of your skeletal system, and obviously associated with that your myofascial system too, because they're working obviously synergistically to ensure that you're developing capacity to tolerate mechanical forces. I think this also then ties in well when we think about, it's important to highlight that with specialisation in youth, we do see a higher prevalence in injuries overall. Some of the injuries that, like you were mentioning before, with regards to apophyseal type injuries, i.e. injuries at the tendon bony interface. But when we think about all types of injuries, we do see a higher prevalence in individuals that specialise, which is in itself is worth exploring why that may be the case. But again, if you think about the point I made before about when you have diversity in sport, you have diversity in the types of forces you're exposing yourself to. And as we mentioned earlier in the podcast, diversity in what you do provides more movement variability. And we need to really highlight this. How we move and having variability in how we run, jump, kick a ball is advantageous from an injury perspective, because it alters where load is being applied to the body. So you can imagine that if I just got you to kick a ball 100 times, if you kicked it the exact same way every time, you're going to really localize the force through a particular point or a particular plane in the body.
And that's where you might get that overload of that tendon structure.
Correct.
That's what we call a apophyseal kind of attachment site.
Yes, as opposed to kicking that ball 100 times, where there's slight variations, where sometimes...
Kicking around corners,
exactly.
You're trying sorts of different things.
Yeah, or even like you might be kicking in the exact same direction, but this time you swing the leg a little bit more, you change the diagonal, the angle a bit, you change the foot position. It's changing variability in where the contact point is and where the force is loaded and distributed in the body. And again, this sort of feeds into the key principle we're discussing here, that how do we improve movement variability? By providing variability in the
task. Yeah.
The task. And I think it's a good way to put it in terms of the physical, tactical, technical, psychological components, because we know that those will influence the outcome that people will achieve.
So in terms of, if we were to summarize these things, particularly from an injury point of view, like what are the you've obviously mentioned exposure to movement variability. What are the other things, and we've alluded to it, I believe, but I think it's really important for us to kind of, highlight that there's several factors that you need to probably be considerate of in the development to make sure that injuries aren't a major part of, that period of development. And we mentioned obviously just then, you need to expose them to different tasks so that they're not overusing a particular task. Another one obviously that we've mentioned is how we expose them to a volume of training, and that's that training load that we spoke about.
Yep.
And we probably didn't get into too much depth on it, but I think the key thing is making sure that it's graduated slowly.
Yeah.
You're not jumping from 2 days a week, but all of a sudden now you got made the rep team, so you're doing 3 days of that as well. Well, 2 days to 5 days is a very big, jump in your exposure to an activity.
Yeah, and just tied in with that is the importance of good coaches, hey? Because, the reality is there's obviously a lot of similarities, and you probably can touch on this more than I can, but, coaching youth is going to be different to coaching adults in some ways, and that is influenced, both are similar in the sense that you need to think about the magnitude and quantifying the training loads themselves. But I also think then too the importance of coaches for youth, of having diversity in how you set up training and training parameters to create variability in what they're doing, which is going to alter the actual physical mechanical load, but then also feed into making sure that they are creating differences in how they complete a particular task. And what I mean by that is, you might be playing basketball, but you alter the dimensions of the court, or it could even be alter the dimensions of the hoop, or that, you're only allowed to dribble it twice before you have to pass it.
And I think what that does too is not only just develop some of those other skills, it manages the intensity of loading that you're doing with them. Like, obviously kids like playing the game, but if all you're doing is playing, 5v5 competitive basketball games as you're training, the intensity of that is quite high.
Yeah.
And whilst developing some of those other skills might be seen as, just skill development, it actually nicely includes a level of variability in the intensity of the training. Shooting free throws is nowhere near as intense as playing 5-on-5 back-to-back games over and over and over as you're training. They're very different things, and it's important that there is variability in that training load, and understanding how much of that very high intensity training a youth athlete is exposed to, and that has to grow gradually over time. It can't go from, as I said, doing 2 days or maybe 1 game a week to 3 games a week is a huge jump, not just in basketball play, but very in high intensity basketball play.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then is there anything else that, well, I think the one that we kind of briefly alluded to, which was, understanding and having some patience around growth periods. Because typically we see some very big changes in coordinative capabilities. We see some stress placed on certain tissues, particularly around the bone, particularly around the muscle tendon complex. For people who have children or who can remember back, all of a sudden you go from being very flexible, as maybe a 10, 11, 12-year-old to being really unflexible or inflexible at 14. I think everyone kind of goes through that experience, and it's because you have this maturation of your bone tissue that happens quite quickly, and your, myofascial system is trying to catch up. So it doesn't have the opportunity to elongate at the same rate, and therefore you're in this weird position where all of a sudden you've got no flexibility, no range of motion, whereas a year ago you were really flexible.
I actually just sort of it then, it's probably a good way for us to think about is if you're working with an injured athlete, you have to modify their training in some way.
You think an athlete during a growth spurt's an injured athlete?
Well, it's not an injured athlete, but I think we kind of need to apply similar principles of understanding that there are different types of stresses being applied to their body in terms of like morphological change, which does influence the integrity of the tissue, where we're thinking about the bone or the muscle tendon unit, and therefore how much physical stress that they can apply as well. And I mean, we see it all the time where you start seeing people start to develop, knee pain, i.e. Osgood-Schlatter, because they're going through a growth spurt but actually still participating in a lot of sport. These are things that we know happen, but we have to be cognizant that is associated with an increased susceptibility to injury, and accordingly make changes to make sure that they don't have a negative outcome.
Yeah. All right. I think if we put that in, summary, right? Because I think we've covered off on most. Is there anything actually on that? Is there anything else that you wanted to cover off on?
Well, look, I think it's probably a conversation for another topic when we think about, say, the
application of resistance training.
Yeah, and things like that. But I think we'll leave that for another.
Let's talk about that soon, actually. I think it would be a good one to go through because it's a question that we get asked often.
No, absolutely.
And I think there are some myths around that as well.
Yeah.
But in terms of overall youth development, I think the key things that we took out of it and that we want to put forward to people to apply is, make sure that you're developing multilateral skills. Make sure you're developing across the whole spectrum of physical, psychological, tactical and technical elements that go into performance. Make sure that you're exposing them to, that level of training or intensity or load gradually rather than jumping from one to the other. And during these periods of growth, you need to be very aware that those variables may actually need to be reduced because no, they're not injured, but it's not that far off from being injured. You've actually got some stress on that system.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope you enjoyed it. If you ever have any questions, feel free to reach out to us either through our social media platforms or our website.